Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, PSC 201, whatever time you're consuming this piece of educational media. This is again your instructor, Vic Minkinus, coming to you live on tape from my COVID compound here in lovely Grovetown, Georgia, the Aiken Tech Outpost in Columbia County. Today we are moving on with Chapter 4. Hopefully we will be winding Chapter 4 up today. We'll have to see how that goes, but we should be able to pull it off. The slides for today's discussion is going to be in the Documents folder. It is Chapter 4, Part 3, 2.0. Now, Chapter 4, Part 3 had been on there for a little while. It was not totally correct. I had to go back and make some corrections. I added a slide. So, if you have the regular Chapter 4, Part 3 open, go ahead and close that out and then reopen Chapter 4, Part 3, 2.0, and that will be the right set of slides. While you're doing that, a little bit more Dave Brubeck. Okay, that's take 5 by Dave Brubeck, by the way. Dave Brubeck, one of the greatest jazz musicians ever to live in the United States. All right, so last time we were wound up with Cumming v. Richmond County Board of Education. Cumming v. Richmond County Board of Education is not in our top 3 worst cases in Supreme Court history. Again, that's restricted to Scott v. Sanford, Korematsu v. the United States, and Plessy v. Ferguson. The only reason Cumming v. Richmond County Board of Education isn't in that top 3 is that it relied on Plessy as precedence. Again, it was a horrible decision. It said basically separate but equal. It didn't even have to be all that equal. Because in the Supreme Court took, in my opinion, the really easy way out, the lazy way out, and it can even be argued the coward's way out of saying that separate but equal was an issue to be decided by the states. And they just sort of left it there. Now, that's going to have a big impact a little bit later on. We'll see when we start talking about Brown v. Board of Education, the seminal civil rights case that left an opening for states to sort of try to weasel their way out of segregation. So we're moving, and again, everything just sort of dries up there. There's not a whole lot of progress on the civil rights front. From 1899 until we're going to jump forward about 50 years. 41 years to be exact. So if you go to the next, we start off with that slide on Cumming v. Richmond County Board of Education. So if you go to the next slide, it's going to be entitled World War II. Now, President Roosevelt, when he began to realize that the United States was going to have to get committed to World War II, which probably happened in late 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, Japan was moving across the Pacific. Definitely by 1940, when President Roosevelt began the Lend-Lease program and began funneling large amounts of material and supplies to the British to stave off a German invasion of England. But President Roosevelt realized that winning the Second World War was going to be impossible without African American support, both in industry and in military service. In the 1940s, the first march on Washington was not Dr. King's 1963 march. The first one was proposed in 1940 because the 50 principal defense contractors that President Roosevelt was going to rely on the heaviest to build his armies and his air forces and his navies for the Second World War refused to hire African Americans. They just had a no blacks policy. They wouldn't even interview them. So there was going to be a massive march on Washington. President Roosevelt headed that off by issuing executive orders and reaching out to the industry, and for almost all of those 50 major defense contractors, getting rid of the racial requirements for hiring. But in 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier began to look at the contributions African Americans were going to have to make. And again, remember, This is just barely 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Pittsburgh Courier started calling for the Double V campaign, which would, in President Roosevelt had started to follow Prime Minister Churchill's V for Victory campaign, where he showed the V sign with his fingers. So there was a V for victory in the war against Germany and Japan, but there was also a V for victory on the home front for racial minorities. And the call was picked up, so the Double V campaign became very important. It's something we hardly ever hear about now. But the Double V campaign was incredibly important, very powerful. And so in June, if we backtrack a little bit, Executive Order 8802 was signed by President Roosevelt in 1941, prohibiting ethnic or racial discrimination in any of the nation's defense industries. So that World War II becomes an opportunity for the United States to sort of open itself up to minorities, to ethnic minorities, to racial minorities. We called on, we as a nation called on African Americans to serve in the armed forces. They were drafted into the armed forces. A lot of times you're given the narrative that they didn't serve in combat roles, but that is not in any way true. One of the very first heroes of the Second World War was Doris Miller, who was a messmate at Pearl Harbor, who when the Japanese were attacking saw that the gunner at an anti-aircraft gun was killed. He took his position and manned that position. For those of y'all who haven't heard, Doris Miller is going to be the next aircraft carrier the United States commissions will be called the USS Miller. After Doris Miller, it'll be the first aircraft carrier named after an African American. Great honor, great hero. But again, you've heard about the Tuskegee Airmen. There were combat units in the infantry and in the armor and the artillery. They served across the board in all the services and all the theaters of operation. But if you go to the next slide, what they came back to, they had spent 4 years of their lives fighting for democracy overseas. And then they came back and did not find democracy in the United States. One of the very first things that happened after the war was over, and it got a lot of publicity, was a serviceman was traveling through South Carolina. The bus stopped. He was headed to his home in New York. The bus stopped. He got off. He was arrested for no reason whatsoever, except for being a black man in South Carolina in uniform. He was beaten so severely that he nearly died, and he lost his sight for the rest of his life. African American veterans seem to be targeted even heavier than others because it was, as it was said, they, quote, had to be put in their place. Jim Crow laws that had been in effect across the South were really enforced with even greater intensity. Now, Jim Crow laws were those laws that codified segregation across the South. And no, the South wasn't the only place where there were Jim Crow laws. There were segregationist laws all over the United States, but the South was where it ran and drove all of culture, all of society. It attempted to segregate every single aspect of culture based on race. You had segregated swimming pools, segregated drinking fountains, segregated waiting rooms, segregated libraries, segregated schools, segregated restaurants. And while it was occasionally possible for a white person to go to what was known as a colored establishment, it was illegal and completely impossible to go the other way. And you see some examples in the pictures here. To be honest with you, you guys, I am not that old. I am 58, but I remember seeing some of these signs when I was a kid. Even though they were illegal, and we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about one Supreme Court case before we're done that I am very familiar with what the place where it happened. But I can remember two separate water fountains like you see there in the bottom right-hand corner. And even though the white and colored signs had been taken down, you could still tell which was which. And in the South that I grew up in some of the rural areas, it was still very much a part of the culture that African Americans did not use what had previously been formerly the white person's water fountain. I remember being in a department store in Birmingham, Alabama when I was 4 or 5 years old, so this would have been the mid-'60s. And an African American lady came up and asked where the restroom was, and she was sent to the basement, even though I knew there was a restroom on every floor. And I asked my mother about that, and she just said that that's not something we need to talk about, because it would have caused a fight right there in the middle of that department store. So following World War II, as I said, the laws were enforced with more intensity. Some of the most insidious laws were the laws that ultimately prohibited black voter registration. There would be things like a poll tax, where you would have to pay an exorbitant amount, sometimes in the thousands of dollars, in order to register to vote. But all of those laws allowed for a judge to waive that poll tax. And of course, the judges were all white, and they would waive the tax for a white person trying to register to vote, but would never waive it for a black person. There were literacy tests where you were asked to give discourse on a fairly obscure constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And of course, the test was graded by the registrar of voters, who was inevitably white, and blacks failed and whites passed. And as you can see here, here's 3 counties, one from Mississippi, one from Alabama, one from Georgia, where the African-American minority population in the counties sometimes ran as high as 40 to 50%. And you can see the percentage of blacks, African-Americans, that were registered in each of those counties. In Dallas County, Alabama, which is where Selma is, 2% of the black population was registered. In LeFlore County, Mississippi, that we're going to talk about in just a minute when we start talking about Emmett Till, 2% of the African American population was registered to vote, where the black population was almost 35 to 40% of that county. And then Terrell County, Georgia, was known as Terrible Terrell. It was the county in Georgia where possibly the worst racist violence, some of the worst racist violence took place, 2.4%. And again, I picked those 3 simply because they were the first 3 that popped up when I started researching this lecture. Every state had the same, in the South had the same issue. Now, the secondary effect of this is when you go to trial and you go for a trial by jury, the prospective jurors would be drawn from the registered voter list. So when you attempt to prosecute a white person for racist violence, your jury pool is inevitably going to be all white. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Emmett Till a little bit later, in the lynching of Emmett Till in just a minute. And that's going to be an incredibly important factor. But also, because these things were being so forcefully and so aggressively enforced, it became difficult for the courts to to defend it. So they began to, but they didn't want to overrule Plessy v. Ferguson, because we've talked about how the Supreme Court is so caught up in precedents. They didn't want to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. So they began to back away from separate but equal, but they did it on a case-by-case basis. They refused to sort of aggressively attack separate but equal as a condition. They just wanted to deal with onesies and twosies here and there. But they just had gotten to a point where the courts couldn't look away anymore. They had tried to, since Cummings v. Richmond County Board of Education, to sort of ignore the whole problem. But by the time the 1950s rolled around, after World War II, when the backlash from African Americans performing so well in World War II had finally hit the South in full force, it became impossible for the courts to look away. Go to the next slide. And then we get to 1954. I listed a whole bunch of dates of where we could start talking about the American Civil Rights Movement. Well, World War II sets the conditions, and then the white reaction to black troops coming home sort of sets the conditions. But in 1954, there is just an explosion across, and what happens is in 1954 starts a chain of events that will go through the 1960s. and completely changed the racial context of culture in the United States. So 1954 is the date where we're really going to start. So I want you to go to the next slide. It's a map of the United States. And what this shows is school segregation within the United States. So you see here that there are three or four separate sort of bands. The green states, which you can see are mostly out west and in the northern United States, made school segregation based on race illegal. In blue, in one of those three states, that's New Mexico, Wyoming, and Kansas, left it up to the local school boards, or they tried to limit it in some way. The yellow states had no legislation on it at all, because to be honest with you, having been to Utah, having been to North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, it really wasn't an issue because their ethnic populations were so tiny it didn't even make a difference. So they really didn't need legislation. And then on the red, you can see all the southern states. Racial segregation was encoded in schools, was encoded in law. The one we're going to focus on is that blue state right there in the middle, Kansas. And go to the next slide, Brown v. Board of Education. So in the 1930s, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, began to work for the desegregation of schools, and they started at the top down, so to speak. They started with graduate schools and then colleges, and then they were going to work their way into the local school boards. That whole process got interrupted by World War II. They did have some limited success in the courts. They tried to move into the legislatures, and what they found in the legislatures was the legislatures of all 50 states were dominated by whites. They were never going to get any headway. So what they began to do was, as they looked at the limited success they had in the courts, they looked at the completely lack of success they'd had in any sort of legislative body. So what they began to do was they began to advise parents to attempt to enroll their children in segregated school systems. And when they were denied the opportunity to enroll their child in the school that they should be going to, based on racial segregation rules, the NAACP would provide legal counsel for lawsuits that would follow. Now, they wound up in Topeka, Kansas, and it's Brown v. Board of Education. We're going to see the two children in the title suit, but you can see here there are 6 children in this picture with their parents. There were actually 9 suits that were all rolled in together under Brown v. Board. And sometimes what the Supreme Court will do is they'll say, okay, listen, we're going to roll all these cases together that have a central theme, but we're only going to argue this one. And the one they chose to argue was Brown v. Board of Education. So if you go to the next slide, that's going to have a picture. It's going to say, Brown v. Board of Education. It's going to have a picture of Linda Brown and her sister, Terry Lynn. Kansas was one of those states that allowed for individual school districts to decide if they were going to be segregated. This was the case where the Browns lived, Topeka, Kansas. But they rolled together, again, the cases from South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. was one of those places that had decided the school board had decided to be segregated. And again, remember back then, Washington, D.C. did not have a lot of its own authority or autonomy because it was basically run by Congress. And to appease a lot of Southern congressmen, Washington, D.C. continued to segregate their schools. But in each of the cases that were rolled in, African American students had been denied admittance to certain public schools based on laws allowing the public schools to be segregated. They argued that such segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the lower courts had all relied on Plessy v. Ferguson as precedents. So they had gotten very little traction in the federal courts. And so it wound up in the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court consolidated the cases, and Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas became the case that was argued. And here is the last district court panel that heard it. And their question was basically, does the segregation of public education based solely on race violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? The Topeka, Kansas Board of Education argued that there was, quote, no gross inferiority in the segregated schools, and the physical facilities, the curricula, the courses of study, qualification and quality of teachers, as well as other educational facilities in the two sets of schools were comparable. I don't know anybody that was on the Topeka Board of Education in 1954. I don't know anyone who lived in Topeka, Kansas that might have voted for those guys or voted for the resolution that would have separated the school systems. We do know that giving them the full benefit of the doubt, which is oftentimes very difficult in circumstances like this, the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education really seemed to legitimately make an effort to provide a decent education or an equivalent education to the black students in their segregated schools as well as the white students. And for this district court panel, they were perfectly happy with that. They saw that there was they agreed with the no gross inferiority argument. They literally explicitly cited Plessy v. Ferguson, that separate v equal was precedence. This was separate. This was equal. They denied the Browns' claim, and they appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was argued before the Supreme Court in the spring of 1953. The individual you see here on the right was the NAACP lawyer that argued it. And his name is it'll come to me in a minute. And he winds up being the first African-American Supreme Court justice. And it just, I swear, the name just left me, but we'll get back to it. The case was argued in 1953. Justices Douglas Black, and yes, that's Hugo Black from Korematsu versus the United States. Douglas Black, Burton, and Minton, 4 out of the 9 wanted to overturn Thurgood Marshall. The lawyer's name is Thurgood Marshall. See, I told you I'd remember it. Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice, a great legal scholar. He was the lead counsel for the NAACP in almost every key civil rights case in the 1950s and the 1960s. A great jurist, wrote some of the greatest opinions. Now, if you fly to Baltimore, Maryland, Baltimore-Washington International is now known as Thurgood Marshall International Airport. A great, towering man of America's jurisprudence. But anyway, back to the case was argued in the spring of 1953. Justices Douglas Black, Burton, and Minton, 4 out of 5 wanted to overturn Plessy, period. They thought Plessy v. Ferguson was bad law, and they wanted to get rid of it. Chief Justice Vinson, Justices Frankfurter and Jackson, opposed segregation, but did not want to be perceived as being an activist court. They wanted the legislature to pass federal desegregation laws, so they did not want to rule in favor. And Justice Clark believed it was an issue for the states. And you'll see there that there's only 8 justices at this time, so they had to have at least 5. It had to be 5-3 to overturn. Chief Justice Vinson was the key stumbling block to this decision. He was opposed to overturning precedents. He didn't have any legislation basis, but then Chief Justice Vinson did the civil rights movement a great favor. He died. And Earl Warren was appointed Chief Justice. Now, Earl Warren, we've already talked about. Remember when we talked about the history of the Supreme Court? Warren was again who Eisenhower thought of as his greatest presidential mistake. Chief Justice Warren, he had a conversation with Eisenhower where Eisenhower had said he didn't have anything against the blacks. He could just understand how Southern whites didn't want to associate with them. And Chief Justice Warren, future Chief Justice Warren, just sort of nodded but didn't say anything. When he gets appointed Chief Justice, it becomes really clear that the court is about to make a significant change. So because they can't come to a consensus, and because Chief Justice Warren had not heard the original arguments, Chief Justice Vinson is dead and won't be voting, they asked that the case be re-argued, but only to focus on 14th Amendment issues, due process. And so it was re-argued in the fall of 1953, about 6 months later. Warren knew all but one judge was publicly opposed to segregation. So there are notes. Remember how after they hear the arguments, they go into a room and they have a discussion. Usually the notes of those discussions, and we're down, next slide, to Brown v. Board of Education. You see a picture of Chief Justice Warren. Warren knew that all but one justice was publicly opposed. When they went into conference, Warren made the simple argument that the only reason to sustain segregation was an honest belief in the inferiority of African Americans. So what Chief Justice Warren, remember, the Chief Justice gets to speak first, and then they go by seniority. Chief Justice Warren, right off the bat, says, if you're going to vote for this, the only way you can justify that is by saying that African Americans are inferior. So all the justices that were opposed to segregation but thought that the Congress should be left to resolve it, they have no argument. They really can't say anything. So he's now got all the justices all but one in one place. And that was Justice Clark, who believed it should be resolved by the states. He then argued that not only did they have to explicitly overturn Plessy, but they had to do it unanimously or they were going to face massive Southern resistance. Every justice had to vote for this. The ones from the North, the ones from the South, like Hugo Black was from Alabama. They had to come out unanimously to tell all the lower courts, do not bring another separate but equal case back up to us. We are going to overturn your rulings if you cite Plessy again. He also stated there could only be one opinion written, and that was going to come from the Chief Justice. Several other justices had wanted to write concurring opinions, but Chief Justice Warren sort of slapped that down. He made sure that there was only one opinion to come out of this, and that it was going to come from the Chief Justice of the United States. And remember, this guy's only been in the job a couple of months, and he's coming out this strong right off the bat. Jackson held out because he wanted to write a concurring opinion. He eventually relented and agreed that Chief Justice Warren should only be allowed to write the opinion, and it should be one opinion, and it should be succinct, and it should overturn Plessy. Justice Reed held out. He was the final dissenter, but eventually he came in line as well. So if we go to the next slide, again, another picture of Chief Justice Warren, but it starts off with the court's decision was handed down in 17 May of 1954. And from this point, when this decision is handed down, the civil rights movement in the United States goes off in a completely new direction, and it's a direction that really can't be stopped at this point. Chief Justice Warren said, "We come then to the question presented. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other, quote, tangible, unquote, factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group and equal educational opportunities? To separate black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone." If you're going down to the next slide, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. I want you to just understand the magnitude of that decision written by Chief Justice Earl Warren. The courts, and remember, I had said the courts had tried to back away slowly from separate but equal in schools. Chief Justice Warren sticks a knife in his heart. I mean, right there, he said it cannot be in any way tolerated anywhere. We didn't say in Topeka, Kansas, it doesn't seem like it's okay. He said that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Anywhere they are, everywhere they are inherently unequal. So 17 May 1954, The Brown v. Board of Education decision, as delivered by Chief Justice Earl Warren, shatters the concept that separate but equal is going to be acceptable, that segregated schools are going to be acceptable, and that once you desegregate the schools, that is the bedrock. How you educate your children is the bedrock of society and culture. And once that lock is broken, desegregation has to start to occur across the culture. Now, let me be honest, and we're going to be completely honest here. The South did not take it well. If you go to the next slide, in 1955, it became very ugly. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American young man. That's him there in the hat. His mother had been part of what's called the Great Migration. From the turn of the 20th century, 1900 to the 1930s, 40s, there had been a mass migration as the North began to industrialize. Word got to the South, the Deep South, that there were industrial jobs that paid well. The societies may not have been completely integrated, but certainly African Americans were allowed to build their own communities where they could live in safety. The police forces were integrated so that if somebody did perpetrate a crime against an African American, it would be investigated. The voter rolls were integrated, and African Americans were allowed to register to vote. So the juries would be integrated as well. So it was safer to live in the North than it was in the South. You got better wages. You could buy better houses. So starting at the turn of the century, millions of African Americans migrated from the Deep South up to the industrial centers of the North. Chicago, Pittsburgh, areas around New York, anywhere where there was a major industrial base, African Americans moved north. In fact, the neighborhood that Emmett Till grew up in Chicago was known as Little Mississippi. But Emmett Till, as was often the case, the parents of the parents, when they became parents, these immigrants, they wanted their children to know what Mississippi was like where they grew up. So they would send their children to Mississippi, to Georgia, to Alabama, to South Carolina, to Arkansas for the summers. And in the summer of 1955, Emmett Till's mother sent him to LaFleur County, Mississippi, where his uncle, Moses Wright, was still a preacher and worked as a sharecropper. So just before Emmett Till was supposed to leave in August of 1955, he went to a little general store that was run by Roy Bryant and Carolyn Bryant. There's a picture of three people down at the bottom. Roy Bryant is the one in the middle. Carolyn Bryant is the woman in the three pictures. There was an interaction between Emmett Till and Carolyn Bryant. The nature of that interaction is still up for debate. 65 years later. Emmett Till's cousin and the people and some of the children who were there with Emmett Till said he at worst he got a little flirty with her. There was one of them said that he wolf whistled at Carolyn Bryant. Carolyn Bryant would later say in court that Emmett Till grabbed her by the wrist. Decades later, she later recanted that story. She said she was too old to remember what happened in the store that day, but she would never forget that she lied in court. And then Roy Bryant, again in the middle, and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, not that night, but the next night, went to Moses Wright's house. They kidnapped Emmett Till at gunpoint. They took him to a barn on, I believe it was Milam's property, where he was tortured for a period of hours. He was then shot in the head. He had barbed wire wrapped around his neck, and that was tied to a heavy industrial fan, and his body was thrown into the Tallahatchie River. His body was discovered a couple of days later. There was a move by the local sheriff, because the local sheriff, I believe it was in Sunflower County, Mississippi, was aware of what had happened. He attempted to get Emmett's body buried that very day, because in Mississippi, to get a body exhumed, you needed a court order, and there was no white judge in Mississippi. And every judge in Mississippi in 1955 was a white judge. There was no, and an elected position. Judges were elected positions and still are in Mississippi. There was no white judge that was going to sign an order to exhume his body. But a couple of people that were incredibly brave, the sheriff of Lafleur County, where the body was actually held, again, Emmett's uncle, Moses Wright, it got engaged as well. They got his body on a train as quickly as possible to ship it to Chicago. And again, in that picture in the upper right is Emmett Till's mother. When the body arrived in Chicago, she insisted that they open the coffin. He had been brutally tortured. And there are pictures of his body on the internet. I am not going to show you one because just take it that he was brutally tortured. She insisted that at the funeral services in Chicago, Illinois, that his casket be left open, that people could see it. She allowed the press to take pictures just to see the brutality of what had happened. Milam and Bryant were put on trial in Mississippi. 12 all-right jurors. They admitted to the kidnapping, but they were never charged with the kidnapping for some reason. They freely and openly admitted to the kidnapping. They said they didn't know what. They took him off and talked to him, and then they said they let him go. They claimed they had no idea what happened to him at the trial. Again, Carolyn Bryant testified that he had grabbed her by the wrist, as if that's justification for murdering a 14-year-old boy. And then I want you to go to the next slide. One of the most, to be honest, courageous things that ever happened. This next picture where it says, "There he is." Moses Wright, Emmett Till's uncle, is asked, "Do you see the people who kidnapped your nephew in this court?" And Moses Wright stood up and pointed at Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam and said, "There he is." And that is a seminal. That had never happened before, and it was basically Moses Wright had to leave Mississippi relatively soon after that. He was never able to return because his life was threatened, but it just sort of sounded a bell that the African American community in the South had pretty much had enough. This is where we're going to draw the line. Moses Wright put his life on the line by making that testimony. The jury went out, and it took them just a very few minutes to acquit them on the murder, without the worry of double jeopardy. Bryant and Milam agreed to be interviewed by a journalist from Look magazine, which was at that time the most popular magazine in the United States. The journalist wasn't allowed to ask questions, but their lawyers did ask them questions. And J.W. Milam said during this interview, "What else could I do?" He thought he was as good as a white man. And if the torture and murder and lynching of Emmett Till had not done enough, J.W. Milam did the rest of it, and outrage just exploded across the country. Go down to the next slide. And this was what a group of civil rights organizations, specifically in Montgomery, being led by groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Students the Students Nonviolent Coordination Committee, the SNCC, and a host of others. And they saw an opportunity with the outrage that was coming off the murder of Emmett Till, and then the further outrage from this interview. They began a process of civil disobedience where people would intentionally break the law, expecting to get arrested, knowing they're going to get arrested. And to get the publicity. So on the 4th of December, 1955, we saw her at the beginning of this chapter, Rosa Parks is arrested for not surrendering her seat to a white rider. That very day, or almost that same day, a boycott is announced from black churches across Montgomery that they are going to boycott the Montgomery bus service. Ridership dropped 75% overnight. Black taxi drivers and private car owners, not just black private car owners, but to a certain extent also white private car owners, helped with transportation. There would be points where they would pick people up and drop them off. On the 5th of June, 7 months later, the Federal Appeals Court ruled that the segregation of buses was unconstitutional of the 14th Amendment. In other words, if you're spending public funds on a bus, you have to give all citizens the opportunity to use them as they would. But the organizers of the boycott held off. They refused to lift the boycott until it was decided by the United States Supreme Court. So Rosa Parks' case was being hung up and slow-rolled in the state court system as she appealed. It was going to take years to get it to the Alabama Supreme Court so they could take it up to the Supreme Court. So Browder v. Gale was a case where a number of African-American women from Montgomery who had been discriminated against or treated badly by the bus system launched a civil suit under the 14th Amendment in the federal court system. And it very quickly moved to the U.S. Supreme Court. And on the 13th of November, 1956, they resolved Browder v. Gale. And in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court said any segregation based on race on public transportation systems was a violation of the 14th Amendment of the United States. And again, that is a major move. You see these things beginning to roll. Go to the next slide. It is again entitled Civil Disobedience. So on the 1st of February 1960, 4 African-American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, go to the Woolworths lunch counter. And back then, Woolworths was called a 5 and dime store. It was similar to what, probably it wasn't a fancy department store. It was someplace you could go in. They had lunch counters. But Woolworths had a corporate policy in the South to segregate their lunch counters, and they would not serve African Americans. Now, the idea of sit-ins had been started in 1939 in the Chicago library system, where they had segregated libraries, and a group of white students in 1939 went in and did a sit-in. In Washington, D.C. during World War II, there were sit-ins in multiple restaurants. It was not legal it was just not accepted that you could segregation in the diners and restaurants in Washington, D.C. was just accepted, although there was no legal basis, so they broke that fairly quickly. So there's a history of this, but never in the Deep South, and never like these 4 students, college students took up. They went in knowing they were going to get arrested. When they wouldn't move, the lunch counter was closed. The police came in and arrested them. The next day, 4 other students took their place. The next day, there was 20 students there. And before it was all over with, in July, there would be hundreds, and you can see here the bottom picture, there were hundreds of students lining up, and they would go in and fill all the seats, and they would get arrested. And then they would immediately get replaced by another 10 or 15 students, and they would get arrested. And it got to a point where some of these students were being arrested 10, 15, 20 times. But after the first one, in the 1st of February, sit-ins just sort of exploded across the South. Every major southern city had sit-ins taking place. And while it sounds like it was, just no problem that you could go in, you get arrested here, in a lot of these cases, there are pictures out there, you can go find them, where people are pouring drinks on the students. And they were committed to nonviolence. They were getting hit. They were getting screamed at. They were getting assaulted, and they just sat there. And by July, 5 months later, or 6 months later, Woolworths agreed to desegregate all their lunch counters all across the South. That was a huge victory for the nonviolent civil rights movement. So, if you go to the next slide, the impacts were that it raised the visibility of the civil rights movement. Suddenly, it became nightly news across the nation that there were these people that were lobbying for civil rights in a nonviolent way. It proved the viability of a nonviolent protest, that could gain support. It brought volunteers and resources to the cause. And again, I'm not going through every protest. I could talk to you about when Bull Connor, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham, Alabama, released police dogs on school children who were marching. But what it did was, by raising this visibility across the board, volunteers began to flow in, and resources were being pushed to the cause. The other impact it had was it caused a severe white backlash. Southern governors took all action against the movement that they could legally take, took actions that were illegal, like stopping public protest, which happened every time there was a march in the South for a long time. The police, even though we have the First Amendment right to gather to redress grievances, they would attack them with batons, fire hoses, dogs. Southern governors also, either explicitly or behind the scenes, allied themselves to white supremacist groups like the KKK, and used them to carry out a lot of the things that they didn't think they could do publicly themselves. And then there was a series of things that really just, it got to the point where people anywhere even some of them even in the South have begun to say, hey, listen, that's enough. On the 21st of June, 1963, the three civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwimmer, they're pictured here, were kidnapped by a group of Klansmen, including at least one member of the local sheriff's department. They were murdered. They were buried in a dam. Their bodies wouldn't be found for months. They were buried 16 feet deep in a dam at a local lake. On 11 March, after the Selma, Bloody Sunday in Selma, Martin Luther King called for ministers of people of faith from around the nation to come down. James Reeb, who was the gentleman there in the bow tie, came to Selma. What they were there to do is they were working under the theory that the white supremacists who were running the city would not attack a minister. They were wrong. James Reeb was assaulted. He was hit in the head with a pipe. He was not treated at the way, anybody who was there to support the civil rights movement would not be admitted to the local white hospital. He was taken to the black clinic. They realized that he had a severe brain injury. He was taken to Birmingham, to the University of Alabama Birmingham Hospital, and he died 3 days later. On March 25th of March, 1965, Viola Liuzzo, who is pictured here, was murdered for giving rides. She was there as a volunteer. She was given a ride to a civil rights worker, and Klansmen came up and fired into her car and killed her. And it just got to be where that was enough. So if you go to the next slide that says the results, there's 4 key events that happened in 1963, 1964, and 1965. First of all is the assassination of President Kennedy. President Kennedy, contrary to popular belief now, was not a very popular president at the time of his assassination. He had barely beaten Richard Nixon in the 1960 elections. But his assassination in Texas, a southern state, by a white man was just sort of, the script was written and the narrative was written that Lee Harvey Oswald, who was accused of the killing, was a white reactionary. Even though that wasn't true, Lee Harvey Oswald was a committed communist. But the script was written that it was a Southern white reaction to President Kennedy's support for the Civil Rights Act. The violent overreach by white hate groups and by Southern politicians had just gotten to a point where nobody could ignore it anymore. There became shifts in the white public opinion because, let's face it, even for Northern politicians, the way things were set up, the power structure was driven by white public opinion. And then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson ran for president. Johnson not only took the White House, but Democrats also took both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And what happens in the next 2 years is a flurry of legislation and executive orders that completely changed the legal framework of race relations in the United States. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed. And you can see here, that's President Johnson giving the pen he used to sign the Civil Rights Act to Dr. King. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, ending the poll tax and making any poll tax illegal. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And also, President Johnson signed Executive Order 11246, which authorized federal agencies to enforce the Civil Rights Act. So, The full weight of the federal government is now behind civil rights. And again, reach back 10 years. Again, and falling into this are guys like George Wallace trying to, standing in the face of federal troops, which was actually National Guard units that had been federalized, saying that he would never allow the University of Alabama to be desegregated. So all of this sort of came to a head in 64 and 65. And I'll give you one case that came under the Civil Rights Act, and that's Katzenbach v. McClung. And Katzenbach was the Attorney General of the United States, and Ollie McClung was a guy who owned a barbecue stand in Birmingham, Alabama. I've met Mr. McClung when I was a child. We used to go to Ollie's Barbecue on a fairly regular basis. I wasn't aware of the historic impact of Ollie's Barbecue and Mr. McClung. But the brilliant thing about the 1964 Civil Rights Act is it wasn't passed under the 14th Amendment. It wasn't passed under anything that had to do with race relations or fair treatment or due process. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And it said basically that discrimination interferes with interstate commerce. You can't freely trade with everyone in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. So you can't discriminate against them. In order to ensure free trade, we have to be able to do business with everyone. So racial discrimination in business practices should be illegal. And that held up. So Ollie McClung owned Ollie's Barbecue. It was located on a state highway, which in Birmingham was actually 8th Avenue. It seated about 220 people. After the Civil Rights Act was passed, Mr. McClung would not allow blacks to sit in the dining room. He served them through a takeout window right next to the cash register. And I know it was right next to the cash register because I remember seeing it there. McClung argued that applying the Civil Rights Act to a small private business was illegal and unconstitutional. He also argued that his business was so small, even though he bought most of his meat and meat products from outside the state, about half of his meat a little over half of his meat came from out of state. His business was so small, it had no impact on interstate commerce. The decision of the court was unanimous. Justice Clark wrote the majority opinion, and he said, against this background, we must conclude that while the focus of the legislation was on the individual restaurant's relation to interstate commerce, Congress appropriately considered the importance of that connection with the knowledge that the discrimination was but representative of many others throughout the country, the total incidence of which, if left unchecked, may well become far-reaching in its harm to commerce. So, in other words, what Justice Clark is saying here is, yeah, Mr. McClung, you may be no big fish, you may be no big deal, but if there's 1,000 guys like you that won't trade fairly with based on race, religion, country of origin, you're going to have a massive impact on the interstate commerce. So, yeah, you have to you fall under the Civil Rights Act, and the Attorney General, in suing you was correct. And that became sort of Katzenbach versus V. McClung became sort of the benchmark case for how the court was going to review individual businesses who discriminated against people. The U.S. Justice Department could go after small businesses and force them to comply with the Civil Rights Act. Okay, let's go to the next slide. It says civil rights for women. So we look oftentimes when we talk about civil rights movements, we oftentimes, and rightly so, think about the civil rights movement as being a racial issue. But the Constitution of the United States does not say anything about who gets to be treated, gets to execute their civil rights, gets to use their freedoms with their civil rights. So let's talk real quick about another group, women, 50% of the population of the United States. So in the picture here is of the suffragettes, the people who were trying to get votes for women. And again, women weren't given the vote until 1920. That was 163 years after the 137 years after the Constitution was ratified. So when they're all dressed in white, that's why when you see at the State of the Union address now, whenever there's a joint session of Congress, Women who are in the Democratic Party will wear all white. It's a tribute to the suffragettes. So efforts started to have a conversation about civil rights for women at what was called the Seneca Falls Convention in 1948. It took almost a century. It took 70 years for there to be enough momentum to where in 1920 all women were given the vote. Several states had gone forward and had done it. Excuse me, but on the national level, it took to 1920 for there to be a constitutional amendment. And even at that, the United States, being a patriarchy, always dealt with women legally as what's called protective paternalism. In other words, the presumption was in court that a man could do a better job at almost anything than a woman. The possible exception being child rearing. But in any instance where there was a legal issue that came down between a man and a woman, it was always deferred to the woman. When a woman got married, her husband became the legal owner of her much of her property, and that stayed in place for decades, and was not overturned until much later than you would have thought. But the course began in the 1960s and 70s through the efforts of the American Civil Liberties Union. It won really plucky young lawyer named Ruth Bader Ginsburg began to push hard for applying many of the civil rights decisions that were affecting based on race to gender. And there was a great movie came out last year called A Matter of Sex about Ruth Bader Ginsburg arguing one of those cases. If you go to the next, here's a series of court cases. Griswold v. Connecticut struck down a state law banning contraception in marriage based on privacy, which actually isn't written into the Constitution at all. It didn't deal with the concept of whether or not contraception should be legal, but it did strike down whether or not a man had the right to tell his wife she could not use contraception. The Connecticut thought that if you were married, you should be all about the having kids. And Griswold v. Connecticut struck that down. Said the state didn't have any business getting into the privacy of a married couple and telling them what they could and could not do. In Phillips v. Martin Marietta, a massive defense contractor, the court unanimously ruled that employers could not refuse to hire women with preschool-age children while hiring men with children of the same age. Again, there's that legal paternalism. Martin Marietta thought that women should be at home taking care of those kids, not running around the job market. And in Phillips v. Martin Marietta, the Supreme Court struck that down. In Reed v. Reed, and again, another unanimous decision, the Supreme Court struck down an Illinois law that basically said if there is, in settling an estate, if there is a woman and a man that are the possible executors, you legally have to make the man the executor. And in Reed v. Reed, there was an argument over an estate and who should be the executor. And the courts just the Illinois law said it has to be the man. The Supreme Court struck that law down. And then everyone is probably familiar with Roe v. Wade. There was another case that came up at the same time, said Doe v. Bolton. The court ruled 7-2, not directly on whether or not an abortion should be legal. Should we be able to legally terminate a pregnancy? But what Roe v. Wade said was that it's not the state's business, that a woman has a right to privacy. They also, in both of these decisions, balanced it against the needs of the state to protect people from haphazard medical procedures. But in Roe v. Wade, the court ruled 7-2 that a right to privacy under due process clause of the 14th Amendment extended to a woman's decision to terminate a pregnancy. The last big case, if you go to the next slide, United States v. Virginia. And this was a massive case at the time. The Virginia Military Institute was founded in 1839. It was run, paid for, and sponsored by the state of Virginia. And in 1990, it still had an all-male admissions policy. In 1990, a female high school student applied, was rejected simply because she was a female. She filed a complaint with the United States Attorney General alleging VMI's exclusively male admissions policy violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Attorney General of the United States took the case up. and argued the 14th Amendment case. Virginia argued that VMI's adversative method of training was inherently unsuitable for women. In other words, women's delicate constitutions just can't stand up to it. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States. Virginia offered to, so there's two questions here. One, is it a violation of the 14th Amendment? And two, if it is, what are the remedies for the problem? If you go to the next slide, Virginia offered to open the Virginia Women's Institute for Leadership at a nearby all-women's college. That was their remedy for it. They did do that before they got to the Supreme Court. They would bus women in for ROTC classes, basically, while they attended this other college. The decision was 7-4 against. Writing for the majority at this point, Justice Ginsburg stated that VMI had failed to show exceedingly persuasive justification for a sex-based admission policy, and it clearly violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. She further stated that the VWIL program is a pale shadow of VMI in terms of the range of curricular choices and faculty stress and faculty stature, funding, prestige, alumni support, and influence. So basically, she said you can't set up something else and still say it's the Virginia Military Institute. It's not. So the state of Virginia had to start admitting women to the Virginia Military Institute. And you can see from the picture that came from last year, women are high-ranking members of the Cadet Corps now at VMI. Okay, go to the next slide, affirmative action. So it is inarguable that the United States has a history of discrimination. The first enslaved people were introduced in a settlement in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The court didn't commit to equality under the law for schools until Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. That's 335 years of legal discrimination in our schools. And schools are always the gateway to jobs. So how do we end it? How do we correct 335 years of state-sponsored racism? And again, you may have people argue that, but it is inarguable that, we could even extend that up to the 1960s when schools across the nation, the last major school district to desegregate was Boston, Massachusetts, believe it or not, and that was not to the 1970s. How do we correct that? And the answer became what's known now as affirmative action. An active effort, Merriam-Webster defines it as an active effort to improve the employment or educational opportunities of members of minority groups and women. So the goal would be the equality of results. In other words, everyone gets the same test scores. Everyone's viewed equally in the job market. But how do you get to that equality of results? Do we institute quotas? Do we say, hey, listen, if 20% of your population is African American, 20% of your students have to be African American? In the job market, do we target recruiting in areas? And that's been very effective for a lot of people. A lot of engineering firms will go to Tuskegee Institute. They'll go to North Carolina A&T. They'll go to historically black colleges and universities and recruit there in targeted recruiting. One of the first cases of this and everyone was accepting this until a case called Bakke v. California. Richard Bakke in 1978 had been denied the opportunity to attend the University of California Medical School. He sued because he was aware that minority students with lower test scores than he were admitted. The Supreme Court sided with Bakke. He was admitted to the California Medical School. And the Supreme Court has gone back and forth. They're about 50-50 on affirmative action cases. But the question is, have we achieved our goals? Go to the next slide, college enrollment. I picked the University of Alabama because, again, I could find it easily, but I could tell you that this is really indicative of a lot of schools in the United States. My alma mater, Auburn University, I know is still struggling with this issue. Other schools like University of South Carolina, Mississippi State University are still doing really well. But other schools like the University of Mississippi, University of Arkansas are really struggling with this. You see the Alabama population in general, and then you see the University of Alabama enrollment. There's a clear deficit in the number of African-American black students that are enrolled in the University of Alabama as opposed to the state population as a whole. The University of Alabama is supposed to be representative of the entire state, but clearly in this case it is not. So we haven't achieved what we need. So go to the next slide. To sort of sum up all of Chapter 4, which it seems like we started, when we started Chapter 4, we still had schools. What we've learned so far is that all three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, have a duty to protect our civil liberties and our civil rights. All branches serve as a check to the others to stop them from being discriminatory and to infringe on our civil liberties and civil rights, but they can also serve as a forcing function. In other words, they can make the other branches do things. Especially with civil rights and civil liberties, you've seen the courts over and over again forcing the legislatures to move forward, forcing the executive to move forward. But if you go back to Plessy v. Ferguson, in the 19th century, the courts were stopping legislatures from moving forward by allowing them to be discriminatory. We also learned that as citizens, we can access multiple points to achieve change. We can go to the legislature. In 1964, the Democrats took both the House and the Senate, and that allowed for the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 1965 to be passed. We can go to the courts to be heard. We can appeal directly to the executive. Remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1941 issued an executive order ending race-based hiring in defense industries. So all three branches of government gives us access points to help to redress these grievances. But clearly, today, we haven't, quote, fixed civil rights. I had someone, and I got that phrase from someone I know. We were discussing civil rights, and he looked at me and he just said, "What do you mean, haven't we fixed civil rights already?" And I'm like going, how can you even say that? I mean, we know that there are a higher percentage of African Americans in our prisons than any other minority group. We know that African American unemployment always leads white unemployment, even across educational levels. The only place where it becomes comparable is a college-educated African American is going to have about the same unemployment as a high school dropout white person. Otherwise, African Americans are going to be unemployed at a higher rate. So as we sit here, 20% of the way through the 21st century, we are left with how do we fix civil rights? So let's go to the last slide here, the discussion question. Countries can always use improvements. What would you say is the greatest way that the United States can improve the civil rights of its citizens in the 21st century? Be free, open, and answering this question, but be respectful and inclusive. This is a dangerous question. I debated putting this question up for a while. But again, let me put it to you like this. In 2050, 30 years from now, when we get halfway through this century, if I'm still around, and that's a big if I'm still around, I'll be 89 years old. My generation, the boomers, would have logged out. The millennials will be getting old. You guys will be in your mid-40s. In 2050, you will be running this country. You should think about what civil rights issues do we need to be addressing as you become registered voters in the next year or two, as you become workers and citizens and taxpayers. What issues do you think need to be addressed in the 21st century to deal with civil rights? And again, if you think we need to just let things run its course, give me a reasoned argument. Now, I'm going to say this. Some of y'all thought a full paragraph was 2 sentences last time. If you do that this time, you're not going to get full credit, okay? A full paragraph is a lot more than 2 sentences. All right, so we've been going on here for about, an hour and 9 minutes.